While the new films Barbie and Oppenheimer are seeing praise in their messages on feminism and history, some Indigenous viewers have noticed the lack of representation and misrepresentation of Native people in them. In the second interview of a two-part series, ICT's Mackenzie Allen Charmley has this interview with Dene filmmaker, artist, and activist Klee Benally.
Many Indigenous film critics and writers have made remarks along the lines of, if you want to include Native jokes and Native narratives within your films, you need Native writers. What is your take on that sentiment?
I think it gets into the point about the institution of Hollywood not necessarily being where we can expect justice to come from. And it's challenging the sort of business of developing these narratives at the root cause. What would permit somebody to think that Oppenheimer, first of all, is a hero and somebody who needs to essentially have a film constructed about him that is a defensive trial, that even though it portrays him as a complicated character and not necessarily in the best light at times, it sort of acts as a tool. And Christopher Nolan has been very clear about this, to celebrate what he has called one of the most important men who have ever lived. So, having that position and, the power that Nolan has to be able to then assemble a team and get the funding, the studio behind him, all the writers, even if you had Native people writing and being part of that narrative is doomed to begin with, because he was an architect of annihilation. And if you don't start with that understanding, you're starting with a frame that essentially is working to vindicate a character that for some people is a total villain. So that's, I don't think you can fix what's broken in this case with Oppenheimer. The narrative should, from a media justice analysis, the narrative should start with those who are most impacted by the violence, by the abuse, by historical traumas, and so forth, by oppression. And if we don't start from that point, if we don't start from the survivors of those people who the bomb was dropped upon, which are completely abstract, they're completely non-existent, essentially. You're just left to the imagination of somebody listening on the radio about the devastation, which is an extraordinary act of violence. The fact that Indigenous genocide is a punchline still in a film that has done the deep work of trying to hold patriarchy accountable and hold a mirror to the toxic cis heteropatriarchal political world that we're living in, is extraordinarily disappointing. And again, it just demonstrates how disconnected, how much of a blind spot there is in white liberal feminism. And this is a lack of understanding of intersectionality. It's a lack of understanding of the impacts and implications of these matters, especially right after surviving a pandemic that has disproportionately devastated Indigenous communities, to make such a callous, irresponsible joke. I mean, it's not a joke, it's a slap in the face with a massive budget that has, people maybe like, looking, like, what was that? Where did that come from? And it was completely unnecessary and didn't need to be there. And it also was probably consciously left in because it seemed like it was a nod to Indigenous people when ultimately it was a slight.
And ultimately, what are you hoping audiences take away from the Indigenous representation that is included within both films?
Yeah, well, as an advocate for media justice, I would advocate that we are critical and understand the power that these narratives have and influence in our lives, and find ways to undermine them by either not supporting them or finding creative ways to empower and use these, empower ourselves in our communities, and use these moments where there is a sort of crisis of that is precipitated through social media. It's interesting that social media is where the noise, the outrage is being made to hold, these films to some degree accountable, even though it's not necessarily impacting their bottom line. But to open up the dialogue and the questions of what is needed, what are the appropriate steps, what ways as Indigenous filmmakers should we be more accountable and more responsible to our narratives? What ways can we uplift and empower on our terms? What institutions do we need to challenge? What institutions do we need to build up and support? And for me, we start with our cultural institutions, our elders, our teachers, who are our cultural knowledge and story bearers, to inform how we should be in this world, and not get that information from mass media, mass pop cultural media, because the more we feed it, the more we empower it too. And we have to understand that dynamic. So to be intentional about media, and to also challenge it, and the commodification, exploitation of Indigenous identity, as I mentioned before, challenge the erasure of Indigenous existence. And I believe this applies critically to the fights against Indigenous mascots, the fights against any kind of stereotyping or essentializations, degradation and dehumanization, and stop playing into these industries, as I mentioned before, and empower Indigenous narratives with culturally rooted media practices.
Are there any thoughts you want to share on the entertainment industry as a whole?
This way of engaging and asking these questions and having these deep and uncomfortable and challenging dialogues, especially after watching a movie, just like getting into those like debates and these discussions, is part of a critical analysis and building critical consciousness that, allows us to build a critical understanding of how media impacts our identities and what we can do to change that.
Well, Klee, Benally, thank you.